Session 57. Good evening. We will have another quiet session, for which I know Robert is always thankful. I am giving you various material along certain lines in preparation for a discussion of some of your own experiments with psychological time. You will be able to understand the explanations for some of your experiences much better with this material as a background. Robert was correct. I was going to speak concerning the self and the so-called not-self, so that we can clear up a few matters. It does seem to me, however, that we have been very sober of late, dealing with weighty concerns. However, I take my chances, getting good material through when the time is right, and we can be more jovial on those evenings when you are too tired to do anything else. As I have said, there are gentle, imperceptible gradations between what is called self and what is called not-self. Your idea, or psychologist's idea of environment, for example, will come close to what I mean. The self indeed, however, reaches out in many ways to form, mold, and construct his own environment, even as it in turn reaches out to affect his core of self. We are speaking, of course, here of the ordinary physical environment. The chemical, biological, electrical, and psychic functions of the self are directly connected to the physical universe as a whole. Theoretically, the influence of a particular given self is endless, and not only in so far as your own physical camouflage time universe is concerned. The influence of any given self reaches also into realities that are not bounded by space and time. This is why I have mentioned earlier that the individual was supremely important. Yet the self limits itself through boundaries that are arbitrary and erected through fear, and also through habit that originally had its source in the necessity for physical survival. Physical survival does not demand these habits any longer, and they remain as shackles. You should know by now that individual thought does not remain within the boundary of the physical individual. This indeed has actually been proven, in so far as telepathy is recognized as a fact, at least by some and soon by all. Therefore, a thought, surely one of the most intimate possessions of a self, does not remain within the self. The thought belongs to the individual from whose mind it sprang, and yet he does not really possess it. He can keep it, but he cannot keep it. He can hold it as his own, and yet he cannot prevent it from passing on to others, though he presses his lips tightly and does not speak it aloud. An individual or a self also cannot hide from others his own basic intent. It is his, and yet, though he possesses it, he still cannot prevent others from sensing it. Along these lines, there is much to be said in that many intangibles, considered most secret by the self, do not remain within the self. No skin or bones or skeletal cage can keep the thought of the self from going outward. The skin and bone, being physical, are adequate barriers to bound other material, but they have no hold over what is not material. A man's intent is subconsciously sensed by everyone with whom he comes in contact. Telepathy accounts for the usefulness of spoken language. Without telepathy, no language would be intelligible. The outward layer of skin, while serving as a physical enclosure, serves as a physical enclosure only for the sake of convenience, as far as distinctions are concerned. In actuality, the outer layer of skin is a flimsy boundary indeed. It is more open than clothed. It is only to your own outer senses that the skin seems smooth. It is indeed more a loose, open framework, through which constantly chemicals, nutrients, molecules, elements, light, sound, and pulsations pass frequently, constantly both in and out. Therefore, speaking in physical terms only, the self is not bounded. It is not independent nor self-contained. It needs for its survival nutrients that come from outside of the skin. Not only this, but in all cases, its own excretions are needed for nourishment of what is not self or by what seems to be not self. This will be a lengthy discussion, and I suggest that you take your break. Be careful of what you do with the pieces. For practical purposes, you might say, and for practical purposes only, that on your plane, the self is limited only by the fields of energy that it can control. The self in non-physical terms, in psychological, psychic, and philosophic terms, is not limited theoretically. Those qualities, those attributes which the self considers most its own, are in no way bounded, nor can they be held in by the self. Thoughts, dreams, purposes, and intents, plans, and wishes are constantly speeding outward from the core of self unimpeded. They are not closeted within the skull as you might think. As many quite real phenomena cannot be seen by your eyes, so with your outer senses, you cannot perceive these constant departures of quality energy from the self into what seems to be not self. These energies, these thoughts and wishes travel. They pass through physical matter. Each self is therefore not only ejecting, almost in missile fashion, such energy from his own core, but he is also constantly impinged by such energy from others. He chooses to translate whatever portions of this energy he so chooses back into forms that can be picked up and understood by his own mechanism. The choice involved is, of course, determined by his own personality, its particular leanings, potentialities, and limitations. We still discuss this later on in connection with illness, good health, and treatment. So far, we have been talking about matters with which you should be fairly familiar. I have said that each individual helps to construct the physical universe. This construction is continually carried on. The individual uses the energy available to him in these constructions. Therefore, these constructions can be said to be projections in your own time and space of any given individual. The individual self is, therefore, literally a part of what would seem to be completely different objects. In a shorthand, you could say that the self is the object which he contemplates, since indeed he constructed the object to begin with from the self. Well noted, Jane laughed. They said, this will make sense to you as you contemplate it. It is true that these constructions take place on a subconscious level, but to the degree that you realize what you are doing, they will become more comprehensible to the intellect, until full awareness of the origin of physical matter would be reached. The self, then, is far from limited even on your own plane. I mentioned, or hinted, however, that the influence of the self, and therefore the self itself, also had reaching effects in realities that did not consist of a space-time continuum. This would have to follow if my statement that the self is truly limitless is true. I hope you can follow me here. We have spoken of the dream world, and of its having a psychic reality, without space or time, as you know it, and an evolution and value fulfillment quite independent of the meager attention that you give it. Your own present personalities are merely the result of the particular qualities and ego images upon which you have chosen to focus your energies and your intent. Initially, before existence upon the physical plane, this time, you could just as easily have focused upon a different quality personality gestalt, although your choice most probably would be in line with a large field of possibilities, possible according to the desires of your entity. Now, although you have chosen to form a particular group of qualities into a field pattern of a particular personality, upon which you focus the bulk of your energy, there are also other more shadowy, less well-constructed possibilities of personality selves that exist loosely within the psychic framework of the dominant personality, and these also have their influence. They also attempt physical contractions to a limited degree, and with limited success. I suggest you break. These secondary personalities, known to psychologists, have a much more important place within reality than is suspected. No psychic action is invalid. Every psychic action exists, has an effect, and has durability in terms of fulfillment. Every psychic action and a psychic action is any psychic happening, such as a dream or thought, that may have no existence in terms of space and time. Every psychic action, then, contains within it the potentialities of fulfillment, transference, and even energy transformation. Secondary personalities are gestalts of more or less loosely affiliated psychic events, unable to find value fulfillment in terms of physical growth and construction as the prime personality can. They seek fulfillment along more accessible lines. No psychic action is static. These secondary personalities cannot be referred to as full selves. Yet they can certainly not be set aside as so-called not-selves. They come into some prominence and fulfillment through dreams and through enticing the main personality at times into the adoption of conscious or unconscious thoughts, which would ordinarily not be chosen by the primary self, and therefore at times altering the course of the primary self. Now again, no psychic action is static, nor is it sterile. The dream world may have no material reality in your plan, and yet its existence in many respects is no less than what you consider reality. The difference is only in the amount of energy which you focus and the direction in which you focus it. The secondary personalities find fulfillment mainly in the dream world, but the dream world is as actual and as real, as effective and efficient as your own. Here, various problems set for the entity are worked out. Problems that either are too minor to be handled by a primary self on your plane, or problems that for one reason or another could simply not be solved by physical constructions. This is extremely important, since the dream world operates within the dimensions of your own psychic field, but utterly divorced from both space-time continuum and the physical construction. Here, you see the self truly spills over, not only into what you would call not self, but into areas with which the conscious self is barely familiar. On an unconscious level, however, the self is very aware of the progress of these secondary personalities, and indeed uses this plane itself for the fulfillment and development of qualities originally attached to it. but incompatible with its main intent. The two planes constantly enrich and affect each other. I suggest you break. It is obvious that physically there is no one self, since the molecules and atoms that construct the cells, that construct the organs, change constantly, and yet we say that identity is retained, and yet even what we mean by the core of identity also constantly changes. I am myself simply does not mean the same thing to a child, an adolescent, a young adult, and an old adult. Though the individual may seem to be the same, and though he retains his memories, he is not the same, and even his memories are colored by the various differences in what I am myself comes to me. Something, you may say, must remain the same. You may insist that also some particular boundary must mark off where you stopped and where something else begins. Surely, at least, where another individual begins. You will say, I am not anyone who is not me. The one stability between self and what is not self, and the one and only difference is not an identity that is part and parcel of constantly changing physical framework, not the alter ego whose conception of who it is constantly changes, according to its age and environment, but the inner self behind all physical constructions. If you then realize that every physical particle contains its own inner and initial consciousness, then you will see that we have come full circle. The individual or the self is all important. It operates to form as complicated a gestalt as possible, following the law of fulfillment, and yet, in so doing, it does not either invade, deny, or negate other individual consciousness. It is limitless because there are no limits to the possibilities of its value fulfillment, or to the number of gestalts which it can form. Now, you should see from this that your universe is therefore itself a gestalt, as an individual cell can be considered to be apart from the rest of the body, as its outer ring can be considered as something that divides it from the rest of the body. So the self can be considered as apart from the universe, and its outer skin thought of as dividing it from the rest of the body. However, as we know, the cell is a part of the body, giving nourishment and receiving nourishment from it. Its outer ring, more correctly, connects it to the body. Parts of it literally travel throughout the body. It is yet an individual. It possesses condensed consciousness and comprehension. It partakes of value fulfillments through the gestalt of which it would not otherwise be capable. If you considered the body as a closed system, which it is not, then you could say that the self of the cell had as its limitations only the limits of the whole closed system. But the system is not closed, and through the participation of the cell in the activities of the body, which is an open system, then you could truly say that the cell itself has no limitations. The gradations, I admit, are extremely gentle. Nonetheless, the end result of each gradation brings us to the conclusion that the self, while being individual because of its inner counterpart, our inner self, is unlimited, yet no invasion occurs. I hope this has not been too difficult, and I suggest you break. I closed our last session somewhat earlier, and I intend to do the same this evening. I had even contemplated cutting down the number of sessions, but do not want to do this. You have both been slightly weary, however, and since the material comes through much more easily now, I can say what I want with few words. I do not want either of you to become overtired, and I do not want to prolong a session when I have delivered my lecture for the night, simply because of any arbitrary idea of time involved, especially when you can both use the stick. I still prefer 2 sessions a week, however, and on those occasions, when the situation warrants it, I will then feel free to continue as much longer as I would like. Within reason, you have been receiving valuable information, particularly of late. Of course, continue with your psychological time experiments. My very best regards to you both, and do not feel upset at my closing a bit early. I know perhaps better than either of you when you become weary, and I also know when to press ahead. You must by now have some idea of what it means to take so much of your clock time for our sessions. At various times, your own energies change their rhythm. I do not mean to suggest that either of you are ill or in low reserves, simply that the psychic energies have their own cycles, and that these cycles must be respected, especially when they are being utilized so well. You will perhaps think that some of your experiments had to do with secondary personalities, Joseph, but so far, at least, this is not so. Very soon now, we will go into your experiences. I would now bid you both a most fond good evening. Again, may I say that I look in on you now and then. Rupert's idea of taking the children's classes at the gallery is a good one. I have not had the opportunity to go into her mistress' matters, but I shall do so. The salesman's ability of Rupert's will serve him well in the children's classes. I am rather surprised that he and his Mr. Matters have managed to get along as well as they have. I would caution him to be very calm at the gallery during the next 2 weeks. And now, good evening. Ralph said good night, Seth.